John Brown's body lies a-mouldering in the grave, while weep the sons of bondage whom he ventured all to save. But though he sleeps, his life was lost while struggling for the slave. His soul is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory,
Welcome
glory,
to War of the Rebellion, Stories of the Civil War. I'm your host, Leon, and this is a reading of the memoir, Reminiscences of My Life in Camp with the 33rd United States Colored Troops, late 1st South Carolina Volunteers, by Susie King Taylor. Chapter 5. Military Expeditions and Life in Camp. In the latter part of 1862, the regiment made an expedition into Darien, Georgia, and up the ridge, and on January 23, 1863, another up St. Mary's River, capturing a number of stores for the government. Then on to Fernandina, Florida. They were gone 10 or 12 days, at the end of which they returned to camp. March 10th, 1863, we were ordered to Jacksonville, Florida, leaving Camp Saxton between 4 and 5 o'clock. We arrived at Jacksonville about 8 o'clock next morning, accompanied by 3 or 4 gunboats. When the rebels saw these boats, they ran out of the city, leaving the women behind. And we found out afterwards that they thought we had a much larger fleet than we really had. Our regiment was kept out of sight until we made fast at the wharf where it landed. And while the gunboats were shelling up the river, and as far inland as possible, the regiment landed and marched up the street, where they spied the rebels who had fled from the city. They were hiding behind a house about a mile or so away, their faces blackened to disguise themselves as Negroes. And our boys, as they advanced toward them, halted a second, saying, "They are black men. Let them come to us, or we will make them know who we are." With this, the firing was opened, and several of our men were wounded and killed. The rebels had a number wounded and killed. It was through this way the discovery was made that they were white men. Our men drove them some distance in retreat, and then threw out their pickets. While the fighting was on, a friend, Lizzie Lancaster, and I stopped at several of the rebel homes, and after talking with some of the women and children, we asked them if they had any food. They claimed to only have some hardtack, and evidently did not care to give us anything to eat. But this was not surprising. They were bitterly against our people and had no mercy or sympathy for us. The second day, our boys were reinforced by a regiment of white soldiers, a Maine regiment, and by cavalry, and had quite a fight. On the third day, Edward Heron, who was a fine gunner on the steamer John Adams, came on shore, bringing a small cannon, which the men pulled along for more than 5 miles. This cannon was the only piece for shelling. On coming upon the enemy, all secured their places, and they had a lively fight, which lasted several hours, and our boys were nearly captured by the Confederates. But the Union boys carried out all their plans that day, and succeeded in driving the enemy back. After this skirmish, every afternoon between 4 and 5 o'clock, the Confederate General Finnegan would send a flag of truce to Colonel Higginson, warning him to send all women and children out of the city, and threatening to bombard it if this was not done. Our colonel allowed all to go who wished, at first, but as General Finnegan grew more hostile and kept sending these communications for nearly a week, Colonel Higginson thought it not best or necessary to send any more out of the city, and so informed General Finnegan. This angered the general, for that night the rebels shelled directly towards Colonel Higginson's headquarters. The shelling was so heavy that the colonel told my captain to have me taken up into town to a hotel, which was used as a hospital. As my quarters were just in the rear of the colonel's, he was compelled to leave his also before the night was over. I expected every moment to be killed by a shell, but on arriving at the hospital, I knew I was safe, for the shells could not reach us there. It was plainly to be seen now, the ruse of the flag of truce coming so often to us. The bearer was evidently a spy, getting the location of the headquarters, etc., for the shells were sent too accurately to be at random. Next morning, Colonel Higginson took the cavalry and a regiment on another tramp after the rebels. They were gone several days, and had the hardest fight they had had, for they wanted to go as far as a station which was some distance from the city. The gunboats were of little assistance to them, yet notwithstanding this drawback our boys returned with only a few killed and wounded, and after this we were not troubled with General Finnegan. We remained here a few weeks longer, when, about April 1st, the regiment was ordered back to Camp Saxton, where it stayed a week. When the order came to go to Port Royal Ferry on picket duty, it was a gay day for the boys. By 7 o'clock, all tents were down, and each company, with a commissary wagon, marched up the Shell Road, which is a beautiful avenue 10 or 12 miles out of Beaufort. We arrived at Seabrook at about 4 o'clock, where our tents were pitched and the men put on duty. We were here a few weeks, when Company E was ordered to Barnwell Plantation for picket duty. Some mornings I would go along the picket line, and I could see the rebels on the opposite side of the river. Sometimes, as they were changing pickets, they would call over to our men and ask for something to eat, or for tobacco, and our men would tell them to come over. Sometimes one or two would desert to us, saying that they had no Negroes to fight for. Others would shoot across at our picket, but as the river was so wide, there was never any damage done, and the Confederates never attempted to shell us while we were there. I learned to handle a musket very well while in the regiment, and could shoot straight and often hit the target. I assisted in cleaning the guns and used to fire them off, to see if the cartridges were dry, before cleaning and reloading, each day. I thought this great fun. I was also able to take a gun all apart and put it together again. Between Barnwell and the mainland was Hall Island. I went over there several times with Sergeant King and other comrades. One night there was a stir in camp when it was found that the rebels were trying to cross, and next morning Lieutenant Parker told me he thought they were on Hall Island. So after that, I did not go over again. While planning for the expedition up the Edisto River, Colonel Higginson was a whole night in the water, trying to locate the rebels and where their picket lines were situated. About July, the boys went up the Edisto to destroy a bridge on the Charleston and Savannah Road. This expedition was 20 or more miles into the mainland. Colonel Higginson was wounded in this fight and the regiment nearly captured. The steamboat John Adams always assisted us, carrying soldiers, provisions, etc. She carried several small guns and a good gunner, Edward Heron. Henry Batchlot, a relative of mine, was a steward on this boat. There were two smaller boats, Governor Milton and the Enoch Dean, in the fleet, as these could go up the river better than the larger ones could. I often went aboard the John Adams. It was with us into Jacksonville, to Cole and Folly Island, and Gunner Heron was always ready to send a shell at the enemy. One night, companies K and E, on their way to Pocotaligo to destroy a battery that was situated down the river, captured several prisoners. The rebels nearly captured Sergeant King, who, as he sprang and caught a Reb, fell over an embankment, and falling he did not release his hold on his prisoner. Although his hip was severely injured, he held fast until some of his comrades came to his aid and pulled them up. These expeditions were very dangerous. Sometimes the men had to go 5 or 10 miles during the night over on the rebel side, and capture or destroy whatever they could find. While at Camp Shaw, there was a deserter who came into Beaufort. He was allowed his freedom about the city, and was not molested. He remained about the place a little while, and returned to the rebels again. On his return to Beaufort a second time, he was held as a spy, tried, and sentenced to death, for he was a traitor. The day he was shot, he was placed on a hearse with his coffin inside. A guard was placed either side of the hearse, and he was driven through the town. All the soldiers and people in town were out, as this was to be a warning to the soldiers. Our regiment was in line on dress parade. They drove with him to the rear of our camp, where he was shot. I shall never forget the scene. While at Camp Shaw, Chaplain Fowler, Robert Defoe, and several of our boys were captured while tapping some telegraph wires. Robert Defoe was confined in the jail at Walterboro, South Carolina. Walterboro, South Carolina, for about 20 months. When Sherman's army reached Pocotaligo, he made his escape and joined his company, Company G. He had not been paid, as he had refused the reduced pay offered by the government. Before we got to camp, where the pay rules could be made out, he sickened and died of smallpox, and was buried at Savannah, never having been paid 1 cent for nearly 3 years of service. He left no heirs, and his account was never settled. In winter, when it was very cold, I would take a mess pan, put a little earth in the bottom, and go to the cook shed and fill it nearly full of coals, carry it back to my tent, and put another pan over it. So when the provost guard went through camp after taps, they would not see the light, as it was against the rules to have light after taps. In this way I was heated and kept very warm. A mess pan is made of sheet iron, something like our roasting pans, only they are nearly as large round as a peck measure, but not so deep. We had fresh beef once in a while, and we would have soup, and the vegetables they put in this soup were dried and pressed. They looked like hops. Salt beef was our standby. Sometimes the men would have what we called slapjacks. This was flour, made into bread, and spread thin on the bottom of the mess pan to cook. Each man had one of them, with a pint of tea for his supper, or a pint of tea and 5 or 6 hardtack. I often got my own meals, and would fix some dishes for the non-commissioned officers also. Mrs. Chamberlain, our quartermaster's wife, was with us here. She was a beautiful woman. I can see her pleasant face before me now, as she, with Captain Trowbridge, would sit and converse with me in my tent 2 or 3 hours at a time. She was also with me on Coal Island, and I think we were the only women with the regiment while there. I remember well how, when she first came into camp, Captain Trowbridge brought her to my tent and introduced her to me. I found her then, as she remained ever after, a lovely person, and I always admired her cordial and friendly ways. Our boys would say to me sometimes, "Mrs. King, why is it you are so kind to us? You treat us just as you do the boys in your own company." I replied, "Well, you know, all the boys in other companies are the same to me as those in my Company E. You are all doing the same duty, and I will do just the same for you." "Yes," they would say, "we know that because you were the first woman we saw when we came into camp, and you took an interest in us boys ever since we have been here, and we are very grateful for all you do for us." When at Camp Shaw, I visited the hospital in Beaufort, where I met Clara Barton. There were a number of sick and wounded soldiers there, and I went often to see the comrades. Miss Barton was always very cordial toward me, and I honored her for her devotion and care of those men. There was a man, John Johnson, who with his family was taken by our regiment at Edisto. This man afterwards worked in the hospital and was well known to Miss Barton. I have been told since that when she went south in 1883, she tried to look this man up, but learned he was dead. His son is living in Edisto, Reverend J. Johnson, and is the president of an industrial school on that island, and a very intelligent man. He was a small child when his father and family were captured by our regiment at Edisto. Chapter 6. On Morris and Other Islands. Fort Wagner. Being only a mile from our camp, I went there 2 or 3 times a week, and would go up on the ramparts to watch the gunners send their shells into Charleston, which they did every 15 minutes, and had a full view of the city from that point. Outside of the fort were many skulls lying about, and I often moved them one side out of the path. The comrades and I would have quite a debate as to which side the men fought on. Some thought they were the skulls of our boys. Others thought they were the enemy's. But as there was no definite way to know, it was never decided which could lay claim to them. They were a gruesome sight, those fleshless heads and grinning jaws. But by this time I had become accustomed to worse things, and did not feel as I might have earlier in my camp life. It seems strange how our aversion to seeing suffering is overcome in war, how we are able to see the most sickening sights, such as men with their limbs blown off and mangled by the deadly shells, without a shudder, and instead of turning away, how we hurry to assist in alleviating their pain, bind up their wounds, and press the cool water to their parched lips, with feelings only of sympathy and pity. About the 1st of June, 1864, the regiment was ordered to Folly Island, staying there until the latter part of the month, when it was ordered to Morris Island. We landed on Morris Island between June and July 1864. This island was a narrow strip of sandy soil, nothing growing on it but a few bushes and shrubs. The camp was 1 mile from the boat landing, called Pawnell Landing, and the landing 1 mile from Fort Wagner. Colonel Higginson had left us in May of this year, on account of wounds received at Edisto. All the men were sorry to lose him. They did not want him to go, they loved him so. He was kind and devoted to his men, thoughtful for their comfort, and we missed his genial presence from the camp. The regiment under Colonel Trowbridge did garrison duty, but they had troublesome times from Fort Gregg, on James Island, for the rebels would throw a shell over on our island every now and then. Finally, orders were received for the boys to prepare to take Fort Gregg, each man to take 150 rounds of cartridges, canteens of water, hardtack, and salt beef. This order was sent 3 days prior to starting, to allow them to be in readiness. I helped as many as I could to pack haversacks and cartridge boxes. The fourth day, about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the call was sounded, and I heard the first sergeant say, "Fall in, boys, fall in." And they were not long obeying the command. Each company marched out of its street, in front of their colonel's headquarters, where they rested for half an hour, as it was not dark enough, and they did not want the enemy to have a chance to spy their movements. At the end of this time the line was formed with the 103rd New York, white, in the rear, and off they started, eager to get to work. It was quite dark by the time they reached Pawnell Landing. I have never forgotten the goodbyes of that day, as they left camp. Colonel Trowbridge said to me as he left, "Goodbye, Mrs. King. Take care of yourself if you don't see us again." I went with them as far as the landing, and watched them until they got out of sight, and then I returned to camp. There was no one at camp but those left on picket and a few disabled soldiers, and one woman, a friend of mine, Mary Shaw. And it was lonesome and sad now that the boys were gone, some never to return. Mary Shaw shared my tent that night, and we went to bed, but not to sleep, for the fleas nearly ate us alive. We caught a few, but it did seem, now that the men were gone, that every flea in camp had located my tent and caused us to vacate. Sleep being out of the question, we sat up the remainder of the night. About 4 o'clock, July 2nd, the charge was made. The firing could be plainly heard in camp. I hastened down to the landing and remained there until 8 o'clock that morning, when the wounded arrived, or rather, began to arrive. The first one brought in was Samuel Anderson of our company. He was badly wounded. Then others of our boys, some with their legs off, arm gone, foot off, and wounds of all kinds imaginable. They had to wade through creeks and marshes as they were discovered by the enemy and shelled very badly. A number of the men were lost. Some got fastened in the mud and had to cut off the legs of their pants to free themselves. The 103rd New York suffered the most, as their men were very badly wounded. My work now began. I gave my assistance to try to alleviate their sufferings. I asked the doctor at the hospital what I could get for them to eat. They wanted soup, but I could not get. But I had a few cans of condensed milk and some turtle eggs. So I thought I could try to make some custard. I had doubts as to my success, for cooking with turtle eggs was something new to me. But as the adage has it, nothing ventured, nothing done. So I made a venture, and the result was a very delicious custard. This I carried to the men, who enjoyed it very much. My services were given at all times for the comfort of these men. I was on hand to assist whenever needed. I was enrolled as company laundress, but I did very little of it, because I was always busy doing other things through camp, and was employed all the time doing something for the officers and comrades. After this fight, the regiment did not return to the camp for 1 month. They were ordered to Coal Island in September, where they remained until October. About November 1st, 1864, 6 companies were detailed to go to Gregg Landing, Port Royal Ferry, and the rebels in some way found some of our forces had been removed and gave our boys in camp a hard time of it, for several nights. In fact, one night it was thought the boys would have to retreat. The colonel told me to go down to the landing, and if they were obliged to retreat, I would go aboard one of our gunboats. One of the gunboats got in the rear and began to shell General Beauregard's force, which helped our boys retain their possession. About November 15th, I received a letter from Sergeant King, saying the boys were lying 3 miles from Gregg Landing and had not had a fight yet, that the rebels were waiting on them and they on the rebels, and each were holding their own. Also, that General Sherman had taken Fort McAllister, 8 miles from Savannah. After receiving this letter, I wanted to get to Beaufort, so I could be near to them, and so be able to get news from my husband. November 23rd, I got a pass for Beaufort. I arrived at Hilton Head about 3 o'clock next day, but there had been a battle, and a steamer arrived with a number of wounded men, so I could not get a transfer to Beaufort. The doctor wished me to remain over until Monday. I did not want to stay. I was anxious to get off, as I knew no one at Hilton Head. I must mention a pet pig we had on Coal Island. Colonel Trowbridge brought into camp one day, a poor, thin little pig, which a German soldier brought back with him on his return from a furlough. His regiment, the 74th Pennsylvania, was just embarking for the north, where it was ordered to join the 10th Corps, and he could not take the pig back with him, so he gave it to our colonel. The pig grew to be the pet of the camp, and was the special care of the drummer boys, who taught him many tricks, and so well did they train him that every day at practice and dress parade, his pigship would march out with them, keeping perfect time with their music. The drummers would often disturb the devotions by riding this pig into the midst of evening praise meeting, and many were the complaints made to the colonel. But he was always very lenient towards the boys, for he knew they only did this for mischief. I shall never forget the fun we had in camp with Piggy. Chapter 7, Castaway. We will continue next week. All right, let's get into some show notes. This has got some interesting things to talk about. Let's get into these show notes. First of all, I really enjoy that there's a steamer called John Adams, because he's one of my favorite presidents. And also, General Finnegan, that Confederate general that she talks about, his men at the Battle of Olustee killed and captured any surrendered or wounded black troops that they found after that battle. So he's not a nice dude that they're dealing with. Basically a modern day war criminal. So using such an underhanded tactic as using a spotter as a flag of truce makes sense. Dude's not nice. Very clever though. The campaign seems very interesting with the certain lights that she shines on and covers. The fact that she's traveling with them as they're fighting and dying is just wild. And I like how they're just, come on, everyone, get on board. And you too, Susie, you're coming with us. Man, crazy. And judging what I have read about the regiment and her memoir, they're using their regiment, behind enemy lines as a raiding force. It's something a lot like what we would use for different special operations groups today. So I think that's pretty neat. And I also really love that her soldiers her soldiers. These soldiers liked her so much, and it just goes to show how much she did for them. Now, of course, when she talks about the skulls at Fort Wagner, that makes me sad because those are definitely probably Union skulls from the Second Battle of Fort Wagner, because I believe that the 54th, the dead of the 54th Massachusetts was buried there. So, that's the 54th, I bet. So, they suffered terrible casualties in that battle. Of course, her meeting Clara Barton is fantastic and so interesting. I love that all of these people that we're reading about get to meet or be present for very historical, significant acts. Meeting Clara Barton while she was working and having respect for her and talking about her. Oh, it's so cool. All right. And Susie King Taylor, keeping herself warm at night with a secret pan of hot coals, is the smartest darn thing I have ever heard of by anyone to stay warm. The Union Army has got to be in shambles about how clever that is, because that's a great way to get around the guard going around at night. I know it was the same for us when taps is on, or when they play taps, or it's lights out. Like you don't get to stay up late unless you're me reading a book inside my sleeping bag, because I couldn't help myself. All right, but anyway, I just love that. It's hilarious that she figured that out. And of course, can we talk about this pig for a little moment? This mascot that little drummer boys would ride around in camp to interrupt prayer meetings, and how it would go on parade march with them, because that's adorable. And the fact that she says, I miss that piggy. Man, I love that. Animals being mascots in militaries is a long tradition, and I'm glad that they got their own mascot for themselves. That's just great. I love that. All right, friends, I'm out of here. Thanks for listening. I will catch you next week. Share, like, subscribe, the channel, the podcast, the YouTube channel, whatever you're doing, the website. Let folks know. I greatly appreciate it. Every little bit helps. Thank you for listening, and I will catch you in the next episode.
Old John Brown's body lies a-mouldering in the grave, while weep the sons of bondage whom he ventured all to save. But though he sleeps, his life was lost while struggling for the slave. His soul is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. For his soul is marching on. John Brown was a hero, undaunted, true and brave. And Kansas knew his valor when he fought her rights to save. And now, though the grass grows green above his grave, his soul is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Hallelujah, for his soul is marching on. He captured Harper's Ferry with his 19 men so few, and frightened old Virginia till she trembled through and through. They hung him for a traitor, themselves a traitorous crew, but his soul is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. For his soul is marching marching on. John Brown was John the Baptist of the Christ we are to see. Christ who of the bondman shall the liberator be. And soon throughout the sunny South the slaves shall all be free. For his soul is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Hallelujah, for his soul is marching on. The conflict that he heralded, he looked from heaven to view on the army of the Union with its flag red, white, and blue. And heaven shall sing with anthems o'er the deed they mean to do, for his soul is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. For his soul is marching on. Soldiers of freedom, then strike while strike ye may, the death blow of oppression in a better time and way. The dawn of old John Brown has brightened into day, and his soul is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Hallelujah, for his soul is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah, for his soul is marching on. For his soul is marching on.